Welcome everyone to our webinar, Causes Count, the Economic Power of California's Nonprofit Sector, New Findings. We are going to be covering all the great new data and an overview of everything in the report today. I am Christina Dragonetti, Outreach and Communications Director for Cal Nonprofits, and with me is Jan Masaoka, our CEO.
Thanks, Christina. I'm here in Sacramento this morning. I just walked out of a hearing at the Assembly, and I just have to say, it always makes me just really proud to be representing California's nonprofits to the legislature. I mean, we are just on the right side. I don't know what other way to put it, but it just feels good to be representing our interests. So I'm very glad to be here this morning. So you all have seen a lot of economic impact reports, right? I mean, just like, the economic impact of craft breweries or of America's Cup or of the new stadium or of anything. But it's very interesting that until we actually did the first one a couple of years ago, there had never been an economic impact report on California's nonprofit sector. So we're very happy to be doing that today. This one is called Causes Count. This is our second edition of it with new findings, and it's a joint project between ourselves and the University of San Diego, their nonprofit center there. And they bring a huge amount of research credentials to the table, and we're just very happy to be working with them on this. And I'm not going to go over this, but I want you to just know that we didn't make this up. We're using very deep, sometimes expensive data sources to find this out. Almost all of it is quantitative. It's very little of it is based on survey, although we do have two surveys that we did, one of California nonprofits, and many of you participated in that, so thank you for doing that, but also of a random sample of California residents, although it was limited to English-speaking California residents. So this is supposed to just impress you. I hope it's doing that. All right, so I'm going to do some kind of questions, and you can just raise your hand to yourself because we're not in a room together. So the first question is, California's nonprofits produce what percentage of California's GDP? And are you thinking it's 4%? Are you thinking it's 9%? Are you thinking it's 15%? Well, the really surprising answer is that California's nonprofit sector generates 15%, 1/6 of California's GDP. So we're not a marginal player. We're kind of a big player, and that's important for us to recognize and acknowledge. And here's kind of a similar question. One out of how many California jobs is it a nonprofit? Now, how many people think it's 1 out of every 14? How many people think it's 1 out of 26? And how many people think it's 1 out of 39? Well, the answer is 1 in every 14 California jobs is at a nonprofit. Isn't that something? So no wonder when you go to a family reunion, it turns out that somebody else there works for a nonprofit too. In other words, we are a really central employer. In fact, if all the staff in California nonprofits were a state, we would be bigger than Delaware. And just as a reminder, how many senators does Delaware have, Christina? 2. They have 2, right? And California nonprofits, how many do we have? So that's why Cal Nonprofits exists, right? And in fact, we have so many employees that the nonprofit sector is California's 4th largest industry by employment. We employ more people than construction. We employ more people than wholesale trade. We employ more people than real estate or finance. And you know how many times we have heard the very legitimate question, what does the construction industry have to say about this particular policy issue? We want, whenever those questions come up, we want somebody to also say, what does the nonprofit community think about this issue? Right. And in addition to our staff, 1 in 14 of California jobs, we also mobilize 4.8 million volunteers. And if we counted up all their hours and put them into 40-hour weeks, it would be the equivalent of 331,000 full-time workers. So actually, when you count that up, actually, we are just incredibly large in terms of our workforce. And in fact, 22% of all nonprofit hours are volunteer hours. So not just like nonprofits are not sort of on the margins of California industry, volunteers are not on the margins of nonprofit effort. Nonprofits and staff work together to produce what we do for California. And this is probably, is this your slides, Christina? No.
No, this one's yours. The next one's mine.
You have to interrupt me. So this is probably the most important number we say in Sacramento. Nonprofits bring more than $40 billion into California from out of state. So, you know, we tend to think about nonprofits as using money that's already in California, but it's very important to recognize that as an economic generator, we actually bring money into California from out of state. And we do that in some important ways. One is that we are huge levers for bringing federal money into California. The second thing that we do is we get money from out-of-state foundations like the Rockefeller Foundation or the Gates Foundation that comes into California. And the third thing is that we get individual contributions from all over the world because people like the nonprofit organizations like the Sierra Club, really groundbreaking nonprofits of all kinds are admired and contributed to by people over all the years. So seeing us as an economic driver and as a job creator is a different way, I think, for us to frame it and an important way for us to do so. All right, now.
I'm going to say.
What, is this your turn now?
Yes.
Okay, sorry, go ahead.
It's okay. One of these boxes represents 37% of nonprofit income. I mean, that's quite a bit of all nonprofits. So not including hospitals or universities. So do you think it's foundations, individuals, squeezed from stones? That might be it. If you think about your organization's budget, might be different from this, but in the nonprofit sector overall, this is where we get 37% of our revenue. It's fees for service and program revenue. 30% is from government, 27% is from individual donations. And it's interesting because most organizations are seen as relying on individual donations, when in fact we get quite a bit more from fees for service and from the government. So when you're thinking about your nonprofit's business model, you can look to see here, we looked into the different business models. What is the breakdown of per subsector of how much money comes from individual contributions, how much is from government, how much is program revenue. And you can see that business models by subsector vary pretty widely. So hospitals, 84% of their money comes from program revenue, which makes sense. Whereas international organizations, only 8% come from nonprofit, from program revenue. So basically the takeaway here is that every subsector has all kinds of income and that the proportions vary, but basically every nonprofit is a hybrid organization. So we can go to the next slide. For this report, we focused on government funding because after earned income, government is the biggest funder. You saw that was 30%. But how government money flows into the nonprofit sector and through the state is really not very well understood. So this just gives you some idea of the kind of where the money comes from and sort of how it comes to nonprofits. Some federal money comes directly from the federal government into nonprofits. Some goes to the state and they add their own and then it goes to nonprofits. The local, the same thing, it comes from the federal government to the local. Sometimes it comes from the state to the local government and then goes to nonprofits. But we focused on federal funding, and it's complicated from our own personal points of view because we don't necessarily know where the money originated. We may be getting a grant from the federal government, in which case we know pretty clearly. But if you're getting from a local government, you're not sure. Maybe there's some state funding in there, maybe there's some federal funding in there. So it is a pretty complicated picture, and it's hard to look at it from your organization, looking at where your funding is actually coming from. So this kind of tells you, these gives you some numbers about where that's coming from in terms of the federal dollars. And so, thank you. Next we have, if we just look at human services, for example, we are looking at, 1.8 billion comes from HUD, supportive services for the elderly direct to nonprofits. Some of it is a state pass-through to nonprofits. So for example, 143 million from the USDA Child and Adult Food Care Program is state pass-through, federal money passing through the state. Local pass-throughs, an example would be 95 million to Health and Human Services Head Start Child Development Program. And so that's locally passed through to nonprofits, but that's federal money. It originates at federal money. And we really want to say that the real story here is that government and nonprofits rely on each other. That government relies on nonprofits for 32% of, for example, Medi-Cal services. Nonprofits rely on government for 30% of revenue. So we really are relying on each other. And it's not just that a lot of people think that nonprofits are taking money out of the government, whereas really government relies on us to deliver services and to get things done. So it's a partnership that goes both ways. Just like, for example, the government relies on furniture makers to supply their furniture, they depend on us to deliver services. It's really not a one-sided relationship. Next slide. Of course, there are some problems with that come with government funding, and this is part of the survey that we did of nonprofits in California. These are familiar to you if you get money from the government. For example, 68% of people reported that payments don't cover the full cost of contracted programs and services. Also time required for reporting is a problem. Long negotiating periods, also a problem for folks. So these are policy priorities for us at Cal Nonprofits. For example, last year we did a hearing on government funding, and the first event with the Assembly Committee on the Nonprofit Sector this year will be on payments not covering the full costs, as well as the time that it takes to get paid for the grants that we win. So nonprofits, lots of nonprofits are involved at the county level. We support those efforts. There's really strong efforts in San Jose and San Francisco, Contra Costa, Los Angeles. We support those efforts, but we work directly with folks in Sacramento on these priorities. And one of the ways that we're working with them is on this portal that the state library is building. It's passed a law last year that we supported with Monique Limon, Assembly Member Monique Limon. She is the head of the Assembly Select Committee on the Nonprofit Sector, and we supported it. We had strong bipartisan support to get the state library to build and launch a website that will allow you to search for government grants from all of the different agencies. And they are in development right now. In fact, this morning I was on a webinar to talk about their different samples of what the website's going to look like, so that we make sure that it's as useful for nonprofits as possible. It's going to be at grants.ca.gov, and that will be launching in July, and it looks like they're actually on track, so that's really good news. Next slide. So this final, we just want to talk about, nonprofits, and 2/3 of nonprofits don't have staff. Less than 2% have over $10 million. So we like to talk about our sector as a sector of family farms, and family farms are good. We want to have a lot of family farms. And so we want to be proud of the fact that the nonprofit sector has lots of nonprofits, lots of small nonprofits that are filling the niches that our communities need. And when we're talking about policy advocacy, one of the things that we talk about when we go to legislators is the diversity of the nonprofit sector. So just like, for example, agriculture is dominated by the big agricultural firms, but there's also a lot of family farms. And when ConAgra, for example, one of the big ones, goes to Sacramento, they talk about the small family farms because they know that that's the value that folks see in kind of the farming industry. So I think that, nonprofits, we should be talking more about our family farm nonprofits, the smaller ones, and how we're able to serve lots of different communities, that we shouldn't be embarrassed by that, that we have all of this diversity and they're small and meeting needs locally. And that's a good thing. And that's it for my slides. So back over to you, Jan.
So one of the things that's important to all of us, even though it represents only about 5% of funding to nonprofits, is grants from foundations. So this is a chart that kind of shows you where California Foundation's monies go to. So you can see that, first of all, these bars show you that these are all based on California-based foundations, but the sort of the brownish parts represent what grants that are made for out-of-state or out-of-country organizations. So, but you can see that the vast majority, not vast, but the overriding majority of foundation money in California goes to health and education, and then to lesser degrees to human services, environment and animal welfare, and community and economic development. So I think probably most of us kind of know something like this intuitively, but it's good to have it quantified for us.
And Jane, on that last slide, sorry, on that last slide, it's actually the yellow is the California foundations and the orange is the non-California foundations.
Right,
so it's actually both.
Thank you. My toolbar is covering up the headlines here. So anyway, thanks, Christina, for that. And by the way, in the full report, what you'll see is two interesting charts. One is a list of the 25 California foundations that give the most to California nonprofits. And those aren't that surprising, but what's really surprising is looking at the 25 non-California foundations that give the most money to California. And it's interesting that one of the foundations that gives out-of-state foundations that gives money to California actually gives more money to California nonprofits than any California foundation other than the donor advised funds at Silicon Valley. So I do think it's a message kind of, we need to also look at out-of-state foundations as well as those locally. I think kind of if I were to say, what's the headline for the whole report, it would be two things: democracy and disparities. We in the nonprofit community often see ourselves as working to mitigate disparities. And part of what we're showing here is that these disparities are also reflected in our communities as well. So let me just ask a few more quiz questions. Okay, who has more money, Northern California nonprofits, Southern California nonprofits, or this is why we should be 6 states? And I know all of you Northern California people voted for Southern California and the other way around, but the answer is Northern California. And if you look in the box on the left-hand side, what you can see is that Northern California nonprofits actually generate about $3,200 in revenue for every resident of Northern California, whereas Southern California nonprofits only have $2,300. Now, what is that dividing line? I'm going to say that's at the top of Kern County. That's right over Bakersfield. And that's, first of all, it's the traditional dividing line between Northern and Southern California, but it's also the line where about 50% of the population lives above that line and 50% lives below that line. So it's interesting geographically to see where that division is, but also interesting to see kind of the stark difference between those two kind of mega regions. And then looking a little bit more closely, which nonprofits have more money? Rural nonprofits or metropolitan nonprofits? Poor communities, wealthier communities, mostly people of color communities or mostly white communities? And this one is too easy. Okay, these are the answers. So I'm going to take a look at some of these a little bit more closely. Now, this is a county map, and it shows all 58 of California's counties and how much per resident of that county the nonprofit community as a whole has. It says all the nonprofits in that community, how much money do they have together to serve that number of people in that community? And looking up your county will be very important. It's a very important message to give to your legislators and to your foundation folks, but it's also just give you some examples. So the high is San Francisco with $14,000 in nonprofit communities money per resident, and look at Calusa, $97. So you can see that the amount of money per capita is just enormously different from one county to another. And of course, if you're living in, say, Amador, and you have a homeless shelter in Amador, it's not really a good strategy for you to think, maybe I should be moving to San Francisco because there's more money there. This is just important for all of us to recognize that some areas of our state just have a good deal more to work with than others. And that disparities comes, I think we would understand that disparities would come from individual giving, because individuals tend to be more located in the wealthier areas of our state, but it's also true in government funding. And you can see here, this is by region, not by county, but you can see that in the Bay Area, 34% of nonprofits get government funding. In the Sierras, 1% get government funding. So it just goes again to show that we all need to work together on making government funding distributed more equitably to communities that really need it. And foundation giving as well. So you can see that, for example, in Bay Area and Los Angeles dominate the foundation sector with, these very large amounts of money and grant making. So if you take Bay Area and Los Angeles together, that's almost more than 2/3 of total grant maker. Now we completely know, of course, that foundations do give money to places outside of their particular region. We actually only have a very few statewide foundations that give statewide, but we do have some that are very important. But nonetheless, where a foundation is located is still an important indicator because it tells you kind of, where their staff is, for example, and where their most immediate attention is. So I also want to point out, sometimes in the nonprofit community, we tend to say things like, well, if only people understood us better, they would appreciate us more and give us a lot more money. And one of the big things we want to make sure people hear is the public already likes us. You can see that this was really surprising to us. Now the yellow bars here are nonprofits, the green is private sector, and the gray is government. And you can see that actually, this is again a random sample of English-speaking California residents. Said that we actually gave us higher marks for creating jobs than for business, that we work more efficiently with business, that we expected to come out on top for acting ethically and promoting positive social change. But this really shows you that we have a great deal of public support, and we should embrace that and make the best use of it as we possibly can. So of course, because we're a policy alliance, we also had to ask the question, how much are nonprofits involved with policy? And so we asked the question, within the last 12 months, which of these things have you done? And we were really surprised to see that 76% of nonprofits said that they had met with public officials or their staff. So we are not shying away from advocacy. I mean, sometimes we don't think it's advocacy because I've talked to so many people who say things like, well, we're not really involved with advocacy. Oh yeah, I did talk to the mayor last week because we're asking for a parking zone change in our area, but I mean, is that advocacy? So asking it this way, I think gave us a much better sense of how much people really are involved with it. And then 53% belong to a coalition that lobbies, like California Nonprofits or the California Association of Food Banks or museums. And I think this is really important because nobody can keep track of all the different bills that affect your particular subsector. It's a good idea to belong to a coalition that alerts you for what issues are important. More than almost half of us provided public policy education. 37% of us testified to a government body, and 50% of us encouraged constituents to vote. And we're hoping that this year that all of you will join our Vote with Your Mission campaign, which starts out with encouraging nonprofit staff, volunteers, and board members to vote, as well as to encourage constituents to vote. Because I think that, as we mentioned, if you look at the state of Delaware, with our nonprofit paid staff, we actually have a lot of votes, and we want to use our votes in support of the same values and the same ideals that brought us to the nonprofit work in the first place. So be on the lookout for kind of stuff around Vote with Your Mission stuff. Right? Now here's some examples of changes since our last report that we want to highlight. So first is the disparities are getting worse, not better. And looking just at the metro versus rural, for example, in 2012, for every dollar that metropolitan nonprofits had, rural nonprofits had 61 cents. I mean, that's already a very startling disparity. Now they have 59 cents. So despite, talk from government and foundations about doing more investments in rural areas, we have yet to see that actually moving the needle in this particular way. Since the last report, nonprofit wages are up 23%, although statewide 25%. And this is kind of a reflection that sort of in a downturn or in a recession, like in the last recession, what we see is that nonprofit wages and jobs are much more stable than they are in business. But when there's an upturn, business tends to raise wages and create jobs a little bit faster than the nonprofit community does. Foundation assets in California have grown an amazing 34% to $137 billion. That's billion with a B. And it is also interesting to note donor advised funds, which is what DAF stands for, donor advised funds, that in California right now, California headquartered donor advised funds, so that includes Schwab, for example, as well as the largest community foundations, right now have $18 billion that they're holding in donor advised fund money. Nationally, donor advised funds are now more than 10% of charitable giving. So I think that, we hear from a lot of nonprofits of frustration about seeing giving to nonprofits going down while donations to DAFs are going way up. And then I think this is maybe the most important long-term concern that we have, and that is the shrinking of the middle class. And, I think we're all familiar with the idea nationally of how we have fewer people in the middle class because we have more people who are wealthy and a lot more people who are poor, but we have fewer people that are in that middle zone. And this is also now happening to the nonprofit sector. So actually we have larger nonprofits are getting larger, but the smaller nonprofits, we continue to have a lot of small nonprofits but the percentage of middle class, if you were, nonprofits has dropped. So we're seeing that same, and we think this is a very unhealthy sign for the nonprofit ecosystem, because just like, you can't have great American baseball without having Little League and AAA teams, and maybe you aren't a baseball fan, so you don't know what I'm talking about, but I think you get the idea. And just the same way, we can't have great theater without a rich and vibrant theater ecosystem, and that's also true in domestic violence, it's true in immigration rights. And it's important for us to have a positive and important ecosystem in our nonprofit community, not just a few standouts. Okay, so coming back to this thing, whenever any of us hear somebody say, what does business think? And that's a good question to ask. What we should say is, what else? What do nonprofits think? And because when we know that when we get nonprofits to the table, that we will always say the most important, most compelling things that need to be said about a given issue, but we need to get to the table. And that's a big part of what we at California Association of Nonprofits are doing. More than 100 nonprofits signed on to the bill today that I was testifying at this morning. So when we get nonprofits to the table, we know that we're powerful spokespeople for those issues, but we need to get at that. And this report shows really clearly two things. Number one, we deserve to be at that table. We have 1 in every 14 employees. We bring $40 billion a year into out of state, and we are thought more highly of the public than either business or the government sectors. And the other thing is, when we are at those tables, we need to speak out about disparities. We need to point out that it's the metropolitan, the mostly white, and the mostly wealthy communities that get the lion's share of monies going to the nonprofit sector. And all of us, whichever one we're located in, we need to be speaking out for the ones that have less money. All right, so I know, Christina, you've been gathering questions throughout. And so why don't you pose some of those?
Okay, so we don't have any questions that have been put into the Q&A box. So I think folks were just waiting to see kind of what we had to offer, and haven't put any questions in. So
if you don't have any questions, you can go have lunch, or we'll hang around for a little while and see if people do have any questions.
We have one question. Deanne is asking, do you have county level data available for the percentage of nonprofit jobs?
We are in the process of developing a one-page miniature causes count for each county. And so we had hoped to have that by the end of January, but now I would say probably mid-February is a better target, but we will have that. So make sure you're on our mailing list so that you'll find out when that's available. Okay. And I do want to say there's so much cool infographics in this report and other stuff, for example, showing the racial diversity and gender diversity within the nonprofit community, just all kinds of other stuff that's pretty neat. So I'm hoping that you will have a chance to do that. Oh, and here's a question. I can't read the whole question though.
So Barbara is asking, what exactly will the grant information website provide? So I can just take a second to talk about that. It will be all of the state agencies that offer any kind of grants or loans or advances to nonprofits or businesses or academic institutions. They will all be collated into one website, which is sort of a portal, and so it'll be searchable. And they're developing it now. It's actually very exciting. It's going to have a ton of information, but it's, you know, it still will be in development. So they'll be launching it in July, and they will be adding new features, and it'll give you quite a bit of information, and similar to the federal grants portal, but much more user friendly and a lot more easily searchable. And you'll be able to subscribe to it for certain, if you want to follow certain grants or other things that are available. So so it's a pretty exciting project, and I think it'll be really useful for organizations.
We have a statewide task force of our nonprofit members that are advising us in the state library on this topic. So even once it's launched, we expect to see improvement over time. So it's not going to have foundation grants, but it will have government grants. And I think why this is so important is because, for example, if you're, let's say you're looking for mental health money, you all might think like, look at the Department of Mental Health of the state, and that would be one. But it's also true that there's money, there's a mental health money in housing, it's in fish and wildlife, it's in agriculture, but it's been impossible to find all those opportunities now. And I just have to say about grants.gov, which is the federal website for grants from the federal government, is that it's not searchable, which is kind of unbelievable to have a database that's not searchable. So it's really important to us, and everybody agrees, of course, this database will be searchable.
So Barbara is also asking, are there any free guides to applying for grants? And we wrote one. We wrote a, actually as a part of what came out of Causes Count research, we realized there's tons of workshops and guides for applying for foundation money or building partnerships with corporations, but we didn't see one that was about getting government money. And that's, you know, 30% of the sector gets, is based on government money. So I'm going to put in the chat box, I'll put a link to that, and it is on our website under resources. And as a small nonprofit, what help is out there to help volunteers apply for grants versus hiring a grant writer? Our report, our you know, how to get a government grant is a good one. You don't have to hire a grant writer. Maybe Jen, you can say more about that.
You should really read the guide. It's, you know, it's a little bit like looking for a job. You know, one way to look for a job, for example, is you look at the want ads on Craigslist or something like that, Idealist, and you apply for one. That's one way a lot of people get jobs. But there are other ways too, right? Like, you know, somebody who says there's a job coming up at my agency and it hasn't been advertised yet, but you know somebody, and so you end up getting in. So there are many different ways in which people get to government grants, and so it's worth looking at the different types of ways and seeing which ones that you probably are going to work the best for you. Okay, is that it for the questions?
That's it for the questions.
Thanks everybody for coming. I'm hoping that you feel super excited about like the importance of bringing this data to your boards of directors and to your foundation folks and to your city councils and county board of supervisors and state legislators. So thanks for joining us. And, you know, any comments you have, please feel free to question us by email or by telephone. Thanks a lot. Have a good lunch.
Bye-bye.
Bye.